Good evening. Welcome to the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center at Dartmouth College. This is our January 2023 version of Rocky Talk Live, and it's our pleasure to introduce Alex Torpey, the new town manager here in Hanover, New Hampshire. It's interesting that the topic is about innovation and how local governments can be real places for things to be tried out. I mean, the adage that states are laboratories of democracy tends to claim credit for only a small swath of what constitutes government in the United States. In class this morning, in our Intro to Public Policy class, we're talking about the 89,000 governments that exist in the United States, 51 of which are the states and the federal government. So that's truly the tip of the iceberg when we're talking about governance in the United States, that the vast majority of it goes on at the local level, whether through the 13,000 or so school boards, the 20,000 municipalities, the 16,000 townships, the 3,000 counties, which we'll come back to, I hope, in our discussions, or the 37,000 special districts that exist. Think public utilities, think transportation systems. They're all governments of a sort, and all of which have a wide variety of options to pursue in public policy as to what should be done for the constituents that are served by those special districts or by those school districts or by those municipalities and townships and towns and villages and cities and everything in between. So I think the topic is ripe for conversation, that we really have an opportunity to really dig in and find out whether there are different ways of doing things. Here in Hanover, as a 22-year resident now of the town, we've seen a lot of change, but also a lot of continuity. We've witnessed our town clerk and our town manager have been around forever, it seems, and Betsy McLean, and so we basically have a chance to rethink ourselves and rethink what government means for us in Hanover, New Hampshire, and elsewhere in the Upper Valley. Hopefully our conversation will go beyond just what goes on here in Hanover and incorporate something much larger than that. And maybe they're just sort of, the idea of what is the Upper Valley? What is that? Is that just a sort of a collective action problem where we can push off all the responsibility to somebody else? It's not Hanover, it's the 68 other towns that really need to get their act together. Or is it something that we can do on ourselves or do collectively across towns? Here at the Rockefeller Center, we have our policy research shop. And in the last decade or so, we've done a number of projects, not only for the state legislatures, but for localities on the topic of regionalization. Are we reinventing the wheel too many times? We've basically did a study for Windsor, West Windsor, Wethersfield, Heartland, and see are there ways where they could share resources. We did a big study for the House Finance Committee in New Hampshire on regionalization at the state level of what kinds of programs are being done or replicated multiple times. And then finally, we did a project for Stratford, Vermont, where the town council came to us and said, we think our budget's out of line with the rest of towns of our size, that our clerk is paid too much, our road crews are paid too much, and they didn't really know the answer. So what we did is we took the 24 towns slightly larger than Stratford and the 24 towns slightly smaller than Stratford and ran an analysis on all of their budgets and how much they spend on their clerks and assistant clerks and road crews and all of these other things. There were all sorts of interesting takeaways as to whether or not they were an outlier or not, but the fact that we could find 48 towns that had populations between 950 and 1,120, that there are 50 towns in Vermont that fall into that category, that are duly classified as towns and have their own governments and are running their own things, so that the town clerk might be managing literally 250 residences and is being paid an annual salary and annual benefits to be the clerk for that many households and collect that many taxes, or those few taxes. So we're in an interesting spot where the live free or die mentality on the New Hampshire side of the river causes us to want to sort of go it alone. And yet that mentality has crossed the river because a lot of the towns in Vermont feel the same way. So we can wrestle with that. So Alex comes to Hanover in a rather unique way, I think. I can see why the select board and those that were serving on the search committee were so enamored with his resume as to what he brings to the table here at a fairly young age. It pleases me to no end that we see the next generation of leadership stepping up in a whole host of areas. I recently stepped down as chairman of the board of Vital Communities and was succeeded by someone 30 years younger than I am. And I'm thrilled with that it's not a bunch of old folks, old white men, if you will, running the show around here. And so I think that's rather healthy. Alex comes to us with an educational background, a BA from Hampshire College, an MPA from John Jay College of Criminal Justice at SUNY, City University of New York, and also served as mayor / CEO / president / a lot of things at South Orange, New Jersey. And again, I think that if you know South Orange or Essex County, that's also the home to Seton Hall University. So the town-gown relationship is already built into his system, albeit at a very different level in a more urban setting, if you could call South Orange urban. It's still only 16,000 people as opposed to our 11,000 or so. But it sits in a county that's got almost 1 million people in it, and we sit in a county that's got 92,000 in it. So very different atmospheres. But I think having that experience in governance at the local level in a relationship with an 800-pound gorilla like Seton Hall or like Dartmouth is, I think is very useful to us. So first things first, Alex, just sort of give us your take on that career path that led you to where you are today. And a lot of interesting machinations. I think we can come back and revisit your teaching and what that constitutes and how that might be applicable to the building we're sitting in right now. But just give us that sort of, that pathway that you've followed at this point.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I appreciate you all coming out and chatting with us tonight. You know, I think the pathway there is, it's sort of not straight, it's not traditional, it's got some curves in it. I spent a lot of time on dirt roads and on trails, and it probably looks a little more like that than a road. Mm-hmm. But I also, you know, I think a lot of folks, especially when I talk to other young people, you know, I get interesting reactions to the word career. Mm-hmm. And I think that, you know, I'm not even sure if I consider what I'm doing a career. And maybe it is, and I'm just, you know, sort of not using that label for some sort of millennial rebellion thing. But I think that, you know, my own pathway, I mean, it was sort of inspired a little bit towards the end of high school and in college, getting involved in South Orange, and then when I went to college, not only studying government, but, you know, from sort of day one, participating in student government, which, you know, I think some people don't take some of the extracurriculars that you can do at the college level as seriously as they could. When I talk about, we say, well, how were you able to, you know, walk into a mayor's role, you know, at 23 years old? Mm-hmm. Part of it was that I did student government for 4 years. And I don't think that people give those sort of organizations and experiences the credibility that they really deserve. And so I had a really wonderful time and challenging time, you know, navigating. I think sometimes we also have a framework where, you know, the bigger we get, the more complicated and hard we think the job is. But sometimes the ultra local, I mean, if anybody here has ever been in a sort of homeowner association meeting, mm-hmm. or I mean, those really small meetings can be really challenging sometimes. And so being involved at the, you know, town level and the college level is not the easiest path. But I got really interested in just understanding, you know, I didn't get involved because there was one issue that I wanted to work on. I just wanted to understand really this sort of a broader process of, we've got all this stuff over here, you know, needs, goals, interests, preferences, whatever, and then it goes into some sort of something, and then we get, you know, policy and program outcomes on the other end. And I know for me, towards the end of high school, you know, there was a sort of realization that many of us have at different points in our life, that what goes in and what comes out doesn't really seem to match. Something is happening in between where the sausage is getting made that you end up with a product that you weren't expecting and isn't what you were hoping for. And I became very interested in just sort of understanding systems and how we make decisions on an individual level, on an organizational level, on a community level. So, I did the traditional thing that people do after college, and I ran for mayor of my hometown. To the concerns of my parents, and someone said, well, you don't have a paying job yet. I said, yeah, but I gotta run. And like many of you probably know, many local elected official positions are totally unpaid, or it's paid a very small, stipend or something. That is a huge problem as far as the kinds of people who can access those positions. Mm-hmm. But I loved the experience. I mean, it was really challenging, kind of getting thrown into that. But between that and being on the library board in the town and on the rescue squad and starting a consulting company that took me and my partners and employees to political campaigns and nonprofits in states and different countries all around the world. I mean, it's been super fascinating just seeing how different places play all this out. How do we take what people want to do individually? How does that come together in a collective something? And then we get outcomes from that. And it's just super interesting seeing how that plays out in different places and trying to understand how can we do that better? Because a lot of those upgrades to the process, they're not, at least in my opinion, they're not, liberal or conservative or Democrat and Republican. There's so many things that we can do that actually do get everybody a little bit more of what they want, but maybe they require a little bit of nuance or thinking outside the box. And so that's what I've tried to work on through my consulting, through my work as a town administrator and hopefully here in Hanover.
Great, thanks. Part of that work that you've done in the consulting area has generated a couple of podcasts that you've produced around this theme of rethinking governance. What is it that needs to be rethought? What are the changeable parts or malleable parts in governance that could be rethought? Again, we've had a long service with Julia Griffith as our town manager, and I think she's handed over a fairly stable ship. But that ship's been steered by the select board and Julia for a good number of years. And what do we need to rethink when it comes to what Hanover is doing, isn't doing? What kinds of relationships do they have with the larger community? This might be a good time to sort of talk about the relationship that you might have had with Essex County as a mayor versus the relationship you're going to have with Grafton County. They're very different animals, if we can even call Grafton County an animal. It doesn't do a whole lot for most of us as citizens here. I mean, we've got a $48 million annual budget, and $30 million of that goes to a nursing home for 135 beds. And then $18 million is on everything else. The jail, the sheriff's office, the farm, virtually no social services being provided. So basically, Hanover becomes an island unto itself, or has to rely on Concord to do something for us. And there's really nothing in between. I assume that in Essex County, a much more proactive county government with almost $1 billion budget, there was some safety net provided by the county that we can't expect here in Hanover. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, there's, let's see, I mean, I guess I'll start with, the rethinking piece. I don't want to get too existential or philosophical here.
We are in an academic institution. Feel free to do so.
But I would say, and I imagine we won't linger on this for too long, but I think that the rethinking to do from a governance perspective is really thinking about what sort of frameworks that we inherited that we use to make decisions. And whether it's as individuals and making decisions about what jobs we want, what lives we want to lead, what careers we want to pursue, what we want to have for lunch. I mean, whatever the decision, no matter how big or small, I think the last couple decades in a couple different scientific fields are starting to show us a little bit of what maybe intuitively some people have known for a while, which is that, we have an interesting set of values, I think in a lot of the Western world in the US, where we equate, basically more freedom with more choices. But anybody who's ever scrolled through Netflix for the amount of time it takes to watch an episode of a show knows that sometimes more choices is actually not the best outcome. And we have lots of data and lots of studies that show that there's optimal ranges for number of choices when you're making decisions. But most of us don't really build that as a framework into our lives and say, okay, well, one choice isn't really a choice. 2 choices, I don't really feel great. 20 choices, I get overwhelmed, and then my choice becomes actually removed from my own preferences. And I think those kind of things, and that there's this sort of sweet spot. But there's research out there about that, and it applies to how we think as people, but it also applies to how organizations function and how communities function. And so I think when we think about things at, let's say, a community level, like the town of Hanover and all of the stakeholders in and around and connected to that, the county and the college and the other towns nearby and Vermont, I mean, there's we can go dozens and dozens of stakeholders deep of different organizations and entities that just sort of touch what we do here in town. And thinking about, well, where is a community going? What choices does a community make on an annual basis, especially in communities where the voters or the actual legislative body, so you haven't even really delegated a ton of decision making to a representative group to make the decisions for you. We're saying we're going to be involved in that, and that's an overwhelming process. And we see a lot of towns in New England and in New Hampshire, not a ton of people show up at the town meetings. They tend to be demographically skewed. They're not usually representative of the demographics of the community. How much research and information is happening ahead of time, I think it probably varies a lot depending on the community you're in and the person and the issue. But we have these structures that, I guess I would ask, do they work are they sort of getting us to our goals? And I don't mean to be denigrating to the town meeting, because I actually was only looking at coming to a town with a town meeting form of government. I was not, when I was interviewing for towns, I was not looking at towns that did not have this, because it to me meant that the town and the governing body had a sort of default commitment to engaging with the public, and that there was sort of an extra layer of accountability there. But I think thinking about, well, how do we make these decisions when we think about housing or redevelopment, which are obviously big issues in and around Hanover, well, how do we know whether we should be putting a building here or there or why? And I don't think we have a great handle, and I don't mean in Hanover, I just mean in generally, I don't think we have a great handle on what processes do we use to vet the ideas that then make it to bodies that make decisions that impact our future for decades. We sort of go through the motions and we participate in the processes if we're lucky, and then 99.9% of people don't actually participate in most of those processes, depending on what we're talking about. And so I think thinking about the mechanisms by which we make decisions is probably one of the most important things that we can do.
Right. What about the policy issues that don't neatly disaggregate to the town level? I mean, I think affordable housing is probably one of those big questions for the Upper Valley, for New England, for the country. And doing that 69 different ways isn't really going to solve a problem, because there's basically going to, that's somebody else's problem, or go build them in Lebanon.
Right.
That's the kind of issue. So what's the rethinking around an issue like that? How do we frame that or present that in a way that everyone owns it and everyone is responsible for that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it is definitely, it's been interesting being up here and seeing, New Jersey is a very hyper-locally governed place as well. Lots of local government units, and actually in some cases, or in some respects, I don't know if folks are familiar with the home rule versus Dillon's rule. Yeah. So New Jersey is a home rule state, which means that local governments can make any decision that has not been prohibited by the state. New Hampshire is a Dillon's rule state. I'm not sure the history of the term, but a Dillon's rule state is a state where local governments can only make decisions they've been authorized to make by the state. So if you haven't been given explicit permission to do something or work on something, you're actually not allowed to do it at the local level. And so it's interesting because there is a bit of a funny duality here with the live free or die, because I was expecting a little bit more of an atmosphere and environment where we could experiment, but actually finding that we run into a bunch of issues where we don't actually have the authority from the state to be able to do those things. On the housing front, I think this is a great example of something that is really hard and maybe impossible to do well only at the local level. And New Jersey, similar, we see this I think in a lot of states, where we don't have, most states don't do planning and zoning in the United States.
Right.
Whereas there are other parts of the world where planning and zoning and setting that policy is done at a higher level of government, and then local governments are basically implementing a plan that is set by stakeholders that are coordinating between multiple different geographic, demographic regions. We're sort of responsible for that on our own. One of the things that I've asked in some meetings. Fortunately, we have organizations like Vital Communities that helps sort of coordinate on some of these issues between towns. But one of my questions, which I have so far not gotten a great answer on, is why do we not do all of our master plans at the same time? And so, master plan is a, document that guides the land use planning and development for a community and a bunch of other areas. It's not exactly a strategic plan, but it's sort of our closest thing that we have, and towns are required to do it. But we all do it at sort of different times, and we've got different consultants. And one of the questions in my mind is, well, why don't we all do it at the same time? Yeah, it's going to be kind of crazy to be all doing those things at the same time. It's usually every 5 or 10 years. But if we did that, then when Hanover is talking about housing, we would be having a conversation at the same time Lebanon is. And even though maybe there's not a statutory requirement that the two towns talk, just by virtue of doing the same thing at the same time, I think you'd create an environment that would just naturally enable facilitation a little bit better. But it's difficult. I mean, I work with a lot of the other town managers in the surrounding towns, but if they did their master plan 3 years ago and we're doing it now, I mean, to some degree, we're already out of sync a little bit, and so we're limited in building, okay, well, we'll note that down and get back to that in 7 years when we do ours again. That doesn't really work that well. And so there's not a lot of guidance coming from the state level. Like you mentioned, there's really not, in this regard, coming from the county level. There are these there's sort of NGO-type quasi-governmental agencies, like the Regional Development Corporation, but it's not an organized sort of cohesive governmental hierarchy, I guess. And I think that does limit us because housing issues, homelessness issues, transportation issues, these issues don't care about town borders at all. It doesn't make any difference where we draw the line between one town and another. We care about them, but the issues themselves don't. And so we lose a lot by not having mechanisms for better collaboration there.
I mean, there is that upside of a Dillon rule state where if Concord decided to do something, they could do it. It's more the case in Vermont where you've got these basically litigating affordable housing to its death point of basically taking something. The Stratford Commons is a good example of that, where it took almost a decade to build 25 units, and the initial cost per unit was going to be like $97,000, and it ended up being $220,000 by the time they finished the litigation. There are things that the state can do to simply say, all right, yeah, you have every right to protest or make your point, but it shouldn't take a decade to do so. And so the idea that the town itself has to be an advocate for these kinds of changes to at least codify that the zoning, the way we do zoning could be a little more systematic than the ad hoc way it's being done town by town by town. And some towns in both states still don't have zoning boards. There are no zoning laws. And so I think that's sort of that collective responsibility piece, and having Hanover be a leader in that, I think is one way of getting it. But it's not easy to get from point A to point B on these kinds of things.
No, and I think dissolving some of the boundaries between stakeholders, between the college and the town, between the town and the town next door. I mean, all of those things, I think we need to sort of kind of step back a little bit and not be as rigid about some of those things, because the affordable housing piece, and believe it or not, I mean, it's interesting the differences in some of the problems in some of the states that I'm more familiar with, and now coming up here and learning a lot more about New Hampshire and Vermont. I mean, we can't get the housing built, whereas in New Jersey, they're almost building it too fast. But the way it's decided in New Jersey, and this is not exactly the right explanation, but it's the simplest, because the full thing is almost impossible. But basically, a town will set an affordable housing policy. There's a nonprofit organization that will sue the town if that doesn't meet their sort of standards, and then you basically then pay a retired judge to mediate for months between yourself and the nonprofit, and then what comes out of that is your affordable housing policy. That's not an amazing way to make housing policy. And the problem is that because each town is treated separately from that perspective, and every town has an obligation to build a certain amount of affordable housing, right, which is a fair attempt, which is trying to not say, okay, well, these towns are all going to build it and these towns aren't going to do anything. Like, we all need to, get some skin in the game, but by dividing it up the way it's been divided up there, basically every town is approaching this on an island, and so you have rural communities with no water, sewer infrastructure, no cell phone service, no public transportation, open space. that sometimes if that space is not in permanently conserved land, and that means that it is developable land, they could get hit with obligations of building thousands of units of affordable housing, and so often they have to then rezone. You don't always have to build it, but rezone to basically allow that. And it's crazy to think that way, that we don't want to look at a broader map and say, okay, well, where do the trains go? Where do the buses go? Where are the job centers? Where is there public infrastructure that's already been paid for already? And I think the hard part is that, you know, it can't be competitive. It's not a town versus another town. We need to somehow understand that we all are in this together, and that a town that has a train station or a transit center, like that's a good place to build housing, especially affordable housing, because if you build affordable housing in the middle of nowhere and you have a 2-income earner household, so that now that household has to own 2 different cars for each of them to be able to get to a job, but you have to pay for that to live in that affordable housing, you've changed what that housing costs on a monthly basis. But if you can build that housing in a place, and it's one of the things that I think governments could do, you know, a better job of, is that our financial impact on a community is not just property taxes. I mean, that's what's in our budget, but if we can build housing in a way that makes it so that people don't have to buy a car, if they want to buy a car, you go ahead and buy a car, but they don't have to buy a car to live in that apartment and get to a job, and we can save that person or that family a couple $1,000s a year. I mean, good luck saving $1,000 a year in someone's property taxes. But we can make that impact in other areas of our lives, and I think that's part of the innovation on the local government side is, well, what is not within our traditional boundaries, but we do have an impact on it? Can we be more intentional about that?
Right. I mean, some of the not obscure, but things like cap and trade for housing, that you basically, all right, if Norwich doesn't want to build houses, you're gonna have to buy credits from a town that's going to do it, and so that they're not, oh, we don't have a septic system, we don't have a sewer system, so sorry. That to me is not an acceptable answer if it's a collective problem. If all the towns in the Upper Valley are responsible for affordable housing, everyone has to give its own part to that process.
Well, New Jersey used to have a program that allowed towns to basically sell their affordable housing credits, but what it ended up doing, at least in New Jersey, was segregating and consolidating affordable housing in certain cities, and then basically towns, and so when you leave it up to, the sort of NIMBY-driven public feedback mechanisms where everybody comes, I mean, I don't know how many times I've heard at a microphone, hi, I'm so-and-so from 123 Main Street, and you will not find a bigger advocate of affordable housing than me. But I live around the corner from this development and it can't go here. And at a certain point, we all have to, and we find these sort of things, we all want people to have second chances from, prison and drug rehab, but how many people want to live next? And that, we have a lot of bad biases about about housing in general. And if we allow towns to opt out, but the only mechanism for the opt-out is not some coordinating entity that's saying, here's the jobs and here's the public transit, but it's a town saying, yeah, we just don't want to do this. We're going to find all these crazy biases that get built into the system, and that's something, so there's...
Well, yeah, in some cases, the problem is so severe that any housing is good housing at this point. So if we want to build McMansions, that's just as good, because we have a lot of ill-placed people or underhoused and overhoused people in the midst of all this housing situation. So I think it does call for a larger community-wide meeting of the minds and not having 69 towns go 69 different ways. That's not going to solve the problem.
Well, and we're trying to do that. I can say, the housing front is a big one. One of the areas that I do a lot of work with other town managers on is retention and recruitment of our workforce. I think we all probably are aware. I mean, I think there was probably a year or so where people were saying, oh yeah, nobody's working because people are getting stimulus money, or nobody wants to work anymore, or COVID issues. And I think people are more broadly recognizing that the labor market is changing, that the size of the baby boomer generation that's retiring, especially folks who work in government, which is skewed more towards that generation than the younger generations, that we've got these huge retirement cliffs that have already started and that will probably finish up from the baby boomer generation perspective in the next 5 to 7 years. And we do not have the same number of people entering the workforce on the Gen Z level. And what is happening. And in some ways, this is going to create all sorts of interesting changes. I mean, I think you could make an argument that we have overbuilt a little bit to a size of a labor market that we're not going to have for a long time. And how are we going to provide the same level of services or comparable level of services, but with fewer people doing that? And it's not as easy as just saying, one person can do these 2 jobs, because there's already been a sort of slimming down in a lot of places. Like Hanover is not a bloated government with people sitting around, not doing anything. It's a fairly efficient organization that's doing a lot of stuff. But we have been, on a monthly basis, myself and a bunch of other town managers in New Hampshire and now Vermont as well, get together on Zoom and talk about what we are trying to do from a hiring perspective, in large part because what has already started and what I really don't want to contribute to is towns basically stealing employees from each other from a shrinking labor market.
Yeah.
And every time an employee onboards and offboards, it costs the town money. And maybe some employees are getting a good deal out of it because they're able to move around, but I think some also feel like a little floaty. They want to be in a place where they can build community and build relationships and really enjoy where they go to work. And maybe they're not going to stay for 30 years, but they don't want to, cycle out every year or two. And so, but if the labor market's shrinking and we all are picking from the same pool of people, what's the 5-10 year plan there? And so what we're talking about is trying to find ways, and this is my, not too subtle remark here for some of the folks that are in the audience, of trying to get more young people interested in working in government, and trying to expand the labor pool of people that are actually available, so that instead of picking people from each other's towns, we can have an influx of people who are hopefully going to come in soon enough that they can learn from some of the folks that have been in the positions for a really long time and have all this great experience, but then are going to get to adapt and adopt and do their own thing going forward. But hopefully they can come in a way where they get a little bit of the transition, because I think we don't want to lose the institutional knowledge that we have. And anybody who's worked in an organization, I mean, if you have turnover and you don't have good transitions, it creates a big problem for the organization. We want the experience and the context, but with folks that are saying, yeah, I want to approach this from a different perspective. But a lot of young people don't want to work in government, and the sort of benefits that government has offered for many years, longevity, stability, retirement pay, those are not the most compelling things for most people, under 30 or 40, I think. And it's a lot on, a work-life balance, for example, generationally is a huge shift in how people view that. And that's something that, I'm pretty big on, and trying to sort of implement that culture in Hanover as well, that people should work hard when they're at work, but when you go home, you should be able to unplug and do the rest of your life and not worry about your inbox and not take calls from your boss because, they have a random thought that they wanted to talk about. There's a voice memo feature on the phone, and you can just follow up with that person during work hours tomorrow. But trying to change that culture and let young folks know that this is a place where they can work too, and that we're open to people from kind of all age groups, and we that we want to do that. That's a message that we're trying to get out there.
Great. Let's shift gears and go back to that town-gown relationship here. You've been here 8 months. First and second thoughts and third thoughts about this thing called Dartmouth College sitting smack dab in the middle of the town.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of the most important things, I think, in town is the relationship between the college and the town. And it's interesting. I mean, you mentioned, where I grew up and where I was mayor, at Seton Hall, where I also taught. I mean, we had a bit of a fractured relationship to some degree. My sense here in Hanover is that COVID is, the last few years have maybe challenged some of the existing relationships, and that there have been some really great partnerships in the past, but maybe folks don't quite feel as though that it's as strong as it used to be, or that everybody's talking about everything, and that all stakeholders are planning together ahead of time. I have found, and I will say that I've gotten feedback from people that they have concerns about those dynamics, and myself and our select board a few months ago were invited by the college's board of trustees to meet with all of them. And we have some select board members who've been on the board for more than 10 years. And this is the first time they recall ever being invited to a meeting by the board of trustees. And we were really excited to accept that invitation and go chat with people. And we have built we are starting movement in a whole bunch of different areas that I think are going to be like super impactful in the long run. And so not only are we setting some, we're still working out some of the details and timing, but obviously there's a new president coming in here at the college, and this is a great opportunity to reset, a little bit some of the dynamics, and think about how we can sort of integrate the institutions better. And so we're thinking about, creating some cadence of meetings that maybe weren't on the books before, making sure that, we're doing, our staff work pretty well together, our police and fire and Dartmouth Safety and Security, the planning offices, they have relationships. They're all, I think, on pretty good terms, know each other well. But there's some high level, board kind of, and then, whatever, CEO level planning that I think we really want to do. And I've had conversations with trustees since that meeting, and I'm just so excited about the opportunities here. A really tangible place where this is playing out, I think, in a positive way is we've been putting a working group together of downtown business owners, talking about how things are going in the downtown. Could we do more? A lot of small businesses have had a hard couple of years, and the college has been super participatory in all of those meetings. And it has been, I've gotten feedback from the business owners, they really appreciate having multiple representatives from different places within the college in those conversations, because when asked, and I think there was just an article in the D about this recently, when asked, if you ask a business owner, how does winter break work for you? Not so great for a lot of them. And that was a change made that maybe is the best thing for the college. I'm not necessarily, I don't know one way or the other there, but making sure that plans and decisions on the town end, on the college end, are being made with those other stakeholders knowing about it, so they get the opportunity to solicit feedback and maybe change plans if we need to. So I think we've got some pretty exciting stuff happening in our downtown, and it's a complicated relationship. Obviously, and I'm still trying to navigate, and I don't know when I'll figure out the full table of organization of the college. It seems like you're saying, good luck.
Well, I'm cautiously optimistic about your response. I'm hoping that you're going to the table as a co-equal in these conversations, and that the college is considerate of the positions that the town holds in making their own decisions, and not simply saying, oh yeah, by the way, we're doing this. Right. And we're doing this. We're going to dump over 100 students into the housing market, and we're going to subsidize them while we're doing that. Thank you for your service.
Right.
That kind of thing, that doesn't breed a good relationship in the long term. And frankly, from the Valley community's perspective, that was an insult, because they sat at tables in meetings with the Affordable Housing Advisory Committees and others, the corporate council, and didn't say a word about that, and just did it. To me, that's not a good partnership. And so I think there's room to grow, but there's also room for the college to start acting like a responsible citizen here as well, and not just be part of the bubble.
Yeah, I'd like to think that things like that, what you mentioned about the housing, that even with the infrastructure that we've started to lay, that kind of thing would not happen in the future. And I'll say, it's hard to know. I've been very encouraged so far, and I got a lot of feedback from people. Okay, you got to watch out, et cetera. And as I met residents and business owners, it was. It's
trust but verify.
Yeah, right, exactly. But I would, I think we've got there is no real future without a better integrated working relationship for either entity.
Yep.
And I think that that should be clear to people out there. But I think the opportunities, and this was sort of the pitch that I made with the board, was, we have a lot of things in common that we care about, as institutions. And let's take sustainability as an example. That is such a, Hanover, on the town side, especially from an energy perspective, is so far ahead of the curve. Mm-hmm. And I think the college is interested in getting to that place as well. It's a big lift for all the infrastructure here. But, I think that we can set our sights too low sometimes. And I think that, the sort of pitch to the board was, it would be great for us to both be sustainability leaders.
Yeah.
And I would say, again, in some respects, I think the town, is already. But that's not really, that's not going to solve the problems. Like, I think we need to do something bigger than that. I mean, what company out there in the world isn't environmentally sensitive these days? And I think that if we set our sights here, the resources that exist at the college, the resources that exist in the community and in our town and among our staff and on our boards, like, I think that we could be like a literal national, international example in some of these areas and figure some of these things out and write up case studies and help smaller communities that want to do better but don't have the resources that we do in this community. Like, let's use those resources not only to make good decisions that affect the community positively, but also show other people that we can do more and that we can expect more from government.
Good, good. Well, we've gone a little over what we would expect to do with the back and forth here. We want to hear from the audience. So if we have any questions out there, I see Charlie there. Wait till you get a microphone.
I'm Charlie Whalen. I teach at the Rockefeller Center. I'm also on the board of Alice Peck Day Hospital, and we are feeling the housing constraint with regard to nurses and so on. This is not a loaded question. What is the plan for Rivercrest? Since the college is a big property owner, part of our housing solution could be there. What, if anything, is happening?
That's a great question. I think it's not the easiest property to develop on with some of the kind of brownfields issues, but it is part of a mix of a few different things that we're talking about on the town level and with the college. I think we need to build on the town level and on the college level, we need to build a lot of housing units. And we should do that carefully and planned and together. But I also think there's a lot of facilities that are also not just housing on the town side, on the school district side, on the college side. Like, let's put all of our folks together, all the heads together, put that property inclusive on a map and say, all right, we've got all these different assets and things. What do we need to move around? What do we need to renovate? What do we need to build in the next 20 years? And instead of doing this piece by piece or entity by entity, like putting everybody together. So I feel like it's a bit of a vague answer, and in part that's because we're just having some conversations right now that I just don't feel like we're totally ready to kind of throw out there. But it is in the mix, but my sense is that it's not the easiest property, but would love to see something there that obviously meets all the sort of the environmental kind of requirements.
But then we're back to the 30-year plan, where we've already put in place what the college's vision is for the next 30 years, and it's basically rounding error when it comes to building housing, and that's remote parking on that 30-year plan. So the college itself has put down on paper exactly what they're going to do with that, and that's exactly nothing. So, yeah, there needs to be a broader dialogue and to acknowledge that everyone's responsible for what's going on in this community. So, other questions? Here, and then Barry.
Hi, thank you for
Hi.
being here.
Sure.
My name is Bee Burak, and I'm a sophomore at the college, studying a lot of things, but including environmental policy. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about, given the approach you mentioned, you want to bring in new ideas and innovate. I was wondering if you could talk more about what new ideas you might have for Hanover's sustainability aims. I know you mentioned that you see us as a leader, and I think that's great, and just wondering if you plan to take things in a different direction from how they've been going, and if so, how?
Sure, yeah, I appreciate that question. I think not a different direction. I think we're moving into sort of a new, the last few years has been focused a lot on energy. And although there's a lot of work still to be done, right, we are just about, and hopefully folks are aware, this Community Power Corporation program that is about to launch. And so if you are a resident in Hanover, you're going to be getting stuff in the mail in the next month or two, which is basically going to allow people to purchase not only power at a cheaper rate than what you can just get normally, but also choose more sustainable options as part of our 2030 goals to get everybody on renewable electricity. So that's like pretty amazing that we have this co-op set up. It's a whole, I forget how many towns exactly in New Hampshire are in it. That's all really amazing, great work. And we as a town, we get something like 98% of our power from our own solar field. That was a pretty recent thing that has been done. So those are amazing, great. There's lots of other sustainability threads here. So the one that I've talked to our Sustainable Hanover Committee about and that I'm personally kind of passionate about is food waste and composting. The amount of methane that is released from food waste rotting in landfills, I forget what the stats are, but it's something like, throughout the U.S., the amount of methane produced from that is equal to 12 or 15 or something coal-fired power plants running for the whole year. That's how much emissions are generated just from food sitting on a landfill. I also do a lot, I'm a big outdoors person. I'm trying to kind of build a off-grid kind of camp. And so I'm trying to figure out ways to keep my resources completely self-sufficient on the property, which is harder than I thought it was going to be, even on one person level. And one of the main ways of doing that is taking waste and reusing it as, as fertilizer on a property. And so that to me is a huge opportunity, especially because we have a downtown and the college where you have people filtering through smaller numbers of points where food waste is being generated, right, versus just like, let's take a suburban community where everybody's kind of eating at home or something, in some of the colleges areas, in town buildings, in all the downtown restaurants, we could be doing this. And I think that is sort of our next big phase. It cuts down, obviously, on emissions. It saves a ton of money because we pay for trash based on weight, and food waste is something, I forget the numbers, I'm probably going to give the wrong ones, but something around a third of the weight of our food waste is, or trash is food. But our entire waste stream, I think most of us are aware at this point that the zero sort, single stream recycling, most of that is not being recycled anymore. It is being put in a landfill or incinerated. We're not doing great with our waste stream in the US. We produce a lot of one-time use products. This is an area that is, and as I want to try and be able to build a well and drink, okay, well, now there's microplastics in the water and I've got to filter that. Like, we are just creating so many problems that are so long lasting, and a lot of that is coming from our consumption habits and waste stream. So the thing that I'm hoping to really dig into, and we did have to push the start date of some of this back a little bit because we had a few staffing vacancies we weren't expecting sort of right as we were getting into the budget, so I've had to defer a few projects. But that's the big one on my end. A couple other things that we're looking at that are maybe not quite as primary is moving a lot of paper processes to digital, which doesn't obviously only save the paper and the trees, but I had this interaction with someone in New Jersey, and I won't say who, but they were at the state level, and we were trying to sign some grant paperwork that required a bunch of different signatures from a bunch of different parties that were in different places. And I said something to the person, and the entity I was working with did not take electronic signatures. And and I said, well, do we really have to print this out on the trees that we cut down, then pay someone to put it in a car, then take that car and drive this somewhere else in the state, have that person sign it, then print it out again, then drive it to another part of the state? And the person said, well, why don't you just put it in the mail? And I said, that is the mail. And could we not be driving paper around anymore? Like, what a crazy thing. Like, we want to cut down on carbon emissions, but we're literally I'm sure some of you, hopefully, I don't know where we are quite generationally here, but in Zoolander, the files are in the computer. This is how I feel. Files are in the computer. We don't have to take them out and then make them a physical object that then has to be transported by other physical objects. And if we apply that thinking maybe in a few other supply chains, not just in government, I feel like we could actually have a pretty significant impact there. We spend a lot of money on that, and we waste a lot on things like that. And obviously, it's also more secure and easier for us to do things electronically. So we're trying to move in that direction as well. So those are maybe two things.
One more, while we're sitting, the next question. If you're online and you want to ask a question, it's rockyqa@dartmouth.edu.
Hi, yeah. John Donovan. I'm on the Hanover Conservation Commission. Nice to meet you. And one of the things I'm working with them on is basically how do we create old-growth forests? We're talking about trees. And from what I can see, old, mature forests sequester huge amounts of carbon.
Right.
We're focused on sustainability, lots of mechanical things, and I appreciate all the things you're talking about. But one of the most leveraged things that we can do is not cut down trees and let them grow old growth, 80, and extend rotations, both private landowners as well. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, because in the master plan, which I've sort of had a chance to look at,
Some of the chapter drafts, yeah.
but there's very little talking about not just conservation, but how do we let trees grow? I mean, I've seen 100 degrees 3 times in town this year. Never had seen it before. trees basically can make 5-degree difference in
Right.
temperature in a place. So this is something that I think we need to communicate with the other towns in the Upper Valley as well. Our town forest, the Trescott waterlands, all those things, we should be stopping cutting and taking that money and letting those trees grow so they can sequester carbon, which balances a lot of what we're actually using. Anyway,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on that?
A couple, and first I appreciate your time on the Conservation Commission, and so maybe we can talk a little bit more about that too. If folks are curious about getting involved environmentally and there's opportunities in town, we've got lots of ways to plug in. I'm definitely make that plug before I answer. So I think it's interesting because my understanding is that this is a relatively newer, that people are realizing that this, right, that before, and it's the same, we're moving in better directions with forest fire management, right, where we had this idea of how we thought it worked, and that cutting and growing trees was the best way to do it, and now it seems like that is not the case. And so I think, I don't know what the policy solutions are. I've seen examples where there are funds raised that basically pay private landowners to not cut, and there's different forest management plans that you can enter into in different states. Are there things we could do at the local level? There probably are, and that's a good question, and I'm not sure. Maybe it's some meeting between a few different entities, like who is the sort of visioning entity there? Because I'll say one of the things that I worry about, coming from New Jersey, the invasive species and forest management issues there are outrageous. I mean, the health of the forests, and I know people who haven't spent a lot of time in New Jersey may not know that most of New Jersey much of it is forested, but it is like the number of insects that are just, not just the ash borer and the lanternfly, but the deer issues and all the invasive weeds and plant. It is really hard to maintain a healthy forest, and I worry that we don't have the infrastructure in place for the next 30 years. As things get warmer and more extreme, all of this is going to get harder to do than it's ever been. Every year is going to be the most challenging year to manage our forests. And I don't think we have the awareness and the funding set up to support the kind of programs that we would need.
There are carbon credits that can be used, and there are ways that people can put easements in, but there needs to be some federal and state. We're not going to get it in this state for sure, but in the federal level.
Well, we should try.
Yeah, right. But beyond that is the issue that, in addition to sequestering carbon, old growth forests also protect water supplies. The biodiversity that you're looking at comes from a mature forest. Our forests have been cut down 4 or 5 times already here, whether it's the private lands or public lands here. So we need to, and that's the most leveraged thing that we can do.
So one thing I'll say there is I think that when we look at forest, especially from a management perspective, people tend to think about forests as a sort of asset, right, as an income producer from a timbering perspective. And one of the things that I'd really love to try to figure out how to do, and I think we are well set up for this in Hanover specifically, but in this area generally, is figure out how to do more local farming and agriculture, but not in giant monocrops, but in forests. And I think that, as I've been learning more about ecological, practices and policies, there's a lot of food that can be grown in a wooded, forested setting that we don't, is it going to, are you going to produce, you're going to run your business through it? No, maybe not. But if we have land that we own and we're having trouble getting out of the mindset of thinking about it as something that produces something for us from a sort of income or resource standpoint, perhaps we can find ways. Maybe we should be going out and teaching, we should be inoculating downed old growth trees with, mycelium spores and, collect, and there's all sorts of cool things we could probably be doing that would connect us to the land better than I think most people are, and maybe would produce something out of it where people would say, yeah, why would we cut down these trees? Look at what they're producing. And if you could get that sort of mindset shift, I feel like that would help move us forward a little bit. But we should talk more about that. Yeah.
First, thank you for coming.
Sure. Yeah.
I wanted to follow up on a question about something that Ron proposed and Charlie mentioned a few before there. Ron was talking about the fact that Dartmouth already has like a 30-year plan, and Charlie was talking specifically about the development of the Rivercrest property. The way I kind of tie those two things together is that the town of Hanover also has a plan in place as well. They were calling it like the Dresden Village Plan, which is the kind of the residential neighborhoods just north of town there. And there was a plan already in place about how the town viewed development in that area. And developing Rivercrest was certainly part of that plan. But there were also some other things in there too involving maintaining green space, for example, and not having large buildings there, like above 2 stories and everything there. So right now there's really kind of 2 plans in place. The college's plan, which they kind of generated themselves without really necessarily a lot of Hanover residents' input there. But at least for part of the town, Hanover already has a plan in place and well. And to be honest, the 2 plans are not really compatible. Right. In fact, they're extremely different, to be polite about it there, because it really ties with a whole lot of things. Environmental issues, which a lot of people have talked about, transportation issues, which people have talked about, housing issues, which people have talked about, and certainly the town-gown relationships as well. So as a representative of the town, how are you going to be able to try to reconcile those things where, like, it's a town document, this is what the Dresden Village Plan is supposed to be. Dartmouth now has a plan, they're calling it the North Lime Road development there. And the 2 things, as I said, are not really compatible. How do you foresee trying to mediate the 2 different viewpoints about the future of part of the community?
Paul, I think you hit on something that's important, like sort of the reason why we have to have integration between stakeholders, because multiple plans going in different directions, like what does that do? Sets us up for conflict in the future. And so, I say a few different things. So one is mechanisms where, I think our boards, the town select board and the board of trustees needs to be in discussion on a more ongoing basis. That's something that both boards are interested in doing. So that's exciting, because I don't believe that has happened before. That there's going to be some sort of regularly scheduled meetings where some of these things might, oh, hey, and we're working on this. Wait a second, you're working on a plan? We're working on a, okay, let's put that together. And it's, the reason why we have department head meetings every 2 weeks, just so that if something is missed and there's not some other mechanism for it, someone gives the update and you say, oh, wait a second, we need to connect about that. I'd like to think that some of the misconnections here were not intentional, but were just not, I don't know, accidental, or were a not proactive nature or something along those lines. Myself and the incoming president here at the college, I think we have a lot to work on together, and a lot of it is about planning, and I use that in the sort of planning and zoning sense, because the housing is the #1 thing that is pressuring all the employers in the region, including the college, including the town, including the medical center, including the downtown businesses. Everybody is stuck in this, and we really don't need to be. I don't think that this is an unresolvable issue at all. And so that then I think connects, okay, well, we're looking at building housing, well, where and why? And to me that then, okay, well, we have this plan in place to do this. And so, I don't know, is there some process where we can, integrate those plans together in some way? Or, I'm trying to not say, well, let's create a new plan that merges the plans, because it feels like that's the committee to study committees. But maybe that's not the worst thing to do in this case. But I think at minimum, I guess, without knowing exactly what we're going to do formal plan development wise, at least having the right stakeholders be in constant communication and conversation about all this stuff, I think that's a pretty important step. And so at least there's an informal piece that we can start on. Yeah.
So we have time for one more. Anyone else?
Hello.
Okay.
My name is David Millman. I'm a college senior and student body president. I was wondering, you were discussing the town-gown relationship, and something that wasn't discussed is the Dartmouth student body, which makes up nearly half of the population in the town. So I was curious, given that engagement with young people is something that you're very passionate about, if there are any ways that you're imagining we can do that in Hanover, and whether that can be a blueprint for other municipalities.
Yeah, I think it's super important, and it's something that we've talked about a little bit before, and I've talked to folks on the Graduate Student Council as well. And I know some of you have come out to some of the meetings in town on different topics, and that is amazing. And one of the things that we talked about early on, although we haven't actually created either of these committees formally yet, is what I got feedback-wise from some students was, where students might come to a town meeting and say, hey, we want to be on this committee or participate in something, and the answer would be, well, it's a public meeting. You're welcome to be here. And, that's fine, I guess. But, what we've talked about and what I've committed to is some of the different working groups that we're creating, like the downtown one, which is that we need to have student-identified positions on those committees and make sure that it is clear that we want students to be named as a participating stakeholder. We literally talk about this in the class I teach, where we look at stakeholders and we use housing issues in South Orange or Seton Hall as the example. And the whole class session is about getting super granular with stakeholders and not saying, well, the university and the town, because we can go, and I will go with students, and we'll spend an hour, and we just keep going down to where we're almost at individual person levels, and then we start recategorizing and understanding that this stakeholder group is much more diverse than we thought it was. People have different interests, different needs, and all of that. So that's one piece of it. The other is, let me know when I can come on campus and talk to, if there's anything I can do student body-wise, talking to folks about what we're trying to work on in town, as far as getting people involved in town, or just more broadly talking about ways that people can get involved in government. I hear a lot of people talk about, sustainability issues or, housing issues, and there's so much attention that gets generated today at what's happening, in Congress, but not being able to choose a Speaker of the House is the least of their problems. And a lot of good decisions and things are all happening at the local level currently, and so that person who cares about housing issues but is writing their senator, but there's planning board, in their town maybe that they live in that has a vacancy on it. That's where that person should really be plugging in if they want to make a difference. And so I'm interested in engaging in all those different ways. I think that, the students, like you said, it's a huge part of the residential fabric of the community. And I think we see, problems with not having enough businesses that meet student needs in the downtown. I hope you don't mind if I share this, David. You mentioned that sometimes people late night food options in Hanover, and I've heard this from a few students. And when no offense to CVS as a business, but when they were on the list of late night food options, I said, well, that's tough. And I was just there today getting some stuff. Again, nothing about the business, but I think we've got amazing restaurants and all this stuff, but there's a mismatch a little bit between the audiences, and that's something we literally just met about on Monday with about 20 business owners, is who are our audiences in town, and are we doing enough to get people out? And I'm not ready to say it out here yet, just because we got to confirm some details with the college, but a few interesting ideas came up in that working group meeting that I'm working on with the president's office right now, that I think is going to be a really nice plus for the businesses in town. And in part of that came out from our conversations and conversations I've had with other students, where you made it clear some of the discrepancies here. And so for whatever that's worth, and getting more students to want to provide feedback and participate, please do. And again, I mentioned this at the very beginning, but I got interested in government on my own front, and and was, I think, able to only be successful as a mayor at a young age because I spent 4 years doing student government in every committee and everything that I could go to. And so I hope that we can provide an opportunity in town for anybody who wants to participate or learn more. Come on in,
Great.
please.
Well, thanks a lot, Alex. We certainly appreciate it, and we hope this is the first of many times that you can come back and visit the Rockefeller Center and engage audiences.
I hope so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thanks.